I'm going to bring Chip McGimsey up, our next guest speaker. So Chip, if you could start sharing your screen. A little bit about Chip. Chip is the state archaeologist for Louisiana and director of the Division of Archaeology at the Louisiana State Historic Preservation Office. For Chip, his fun fact that he shared with me is that he lives with 2 dogs and they regularly walk the cane fields around his house. Together, they occasionally see rabbits, armadillos, coyotes, and deer, but Banjo the dog insists on trying to make friends with our resident skunk. So, Chip, I'm going to ask you to take over the show now.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. My task is to talk about how cultural resources are handled during spill responses. And so when we talk about cultural resources, what is it that we actually mean? So these are examples of what we consider to be cultural resources. The upper left there is an archaeological site. It's a shell midden created by American Indians sometime in the past. You can see it eroding out on the lake shore. The upper right is an example of the remnants of a historic building that used to exist in the marsh. You can see a lighthouse that stands out in the Gulf of Mexico. Or there are also examples where we have cemeteries, both pre-contact American Indian cemeteries as well as more recent Euro-American cemeteries that are eroding into the bayou and thus could be impacted by an oil spill. So in Louisiana's coastal zone, in this slide, we're basically looking at the area that's shown in blue. If you're familiar with Louisiana, it's the land basically south of Interstates 10 and 12. And within that area, on average, Louisiana gets about 4,000 reported spills a year. Now, that sounds like a huge number, but it's important to also recognize that many of these are very small, you know, a gallon or 2. And many of them occur in existing facilities, you know, where they already have the capability and there's not any much chance that they would, you know, get out into water. But occasionally there are larger spills, as Ed referenced and noticed in some of his present slides, where the oil does get out into open water and would have the potential to move onshore and affect cultural resources. So this slide shows some examples of spills. The upper left, you can see, this is one of the examples Ed was talking about. I think somebody ran into an oil platform out in the Gulf. And you can see both the spray coming out as well as off to the lower left there, the oil sheen on the water. More typically, what we see are examples of what you see on the center and upper right, where the oil, you can see the oil platform there that had a leak of some kind and the oil has gotten into the marsh. The lower left is an example, particularly of significance to Ed, but this is a pipeline under the seafloor which is leaking. And so you can see the oil bubbling up to the surface and then being carried by wind and currents. And then the final example is sort of the worst case scenario where you actually have a massive amount of oil coming ashore on a shoreline where there might be an archaeological site. Now, obviously not every oil spill is going to affect cultural resources. It all depends on exactly where it happens and where, you know, whether or not there are any archaeological sites or other resources in that immediate area. Here are some examples of what can happen in the worst case scenario. The example on the left is Fort Livingston, which is an 1830s US military fort on Louisiana's coast that was impacted by the BP spill. And in fact, you can see here that dark brown in the water is some of the oil that has gotten onto the fort walls. The image on the left shows one of those shell midden sites that we talked about, an American Indian village site, where there's an artifact, in this case, a large fragment of a prehistoric vessel And the dark stains you see on that artifact are in fact oil from a spill. So some spills obviously will affect cultural resources. What do we do? And what can we do to try and minimize or prevent that? So at this point, I kind of have to apologize to everybody. I have to talk a little bit about laws and regulations so that you can have a better understanding of what it is we can do and what we cannot do. So the first thing to realize is that in the case of the two pictures that you see on the screen there, where the oil has actually gotten onto a cultural resource, there is nothing under the law that provides a means to address that impact. So, whether or not the oil is contributing to the deterioration of the bricks and the mortar, and thus the fort's more likely to, fall apart sooner, or, it's going to affect radiocarbon dates or the ability to analyze artifacts, from a prehistoric site. Unlike biological resources, where there is the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Act, which allows state and federal agencies to assess the effect of oil on plants and animals, shrimp, shrimping areas, oyster beds, and whatnot, and then to essentially recoup funds from the responsible party, whatever party caused the spill, to help pay for mitigating those damages. We cannot do this for cultural resources. There is no federal law that allows us to get money to address the damage on cultural resources. What we can have some control over is what happens during a response effort. So, and this is because if the spill waters, the spill impacts waters of the U.S., then the U.S. Coast Guard assumes some level of oversight for the response. That is, sort of having some say-so over what response activities happen, where, when, who, how, and all of that. They are responsible for ensuring that all federal environmental and cultural resource laws are followed during that process. And that includes the National Historic Preservation Act. And I show you just very briefly the one section that's relevant here, that a federal agency is responsible for things that it has oversight for or that it's paying for, and that they have to take into consideration the effect of that action on cultural resources. Ignoring all the details about the law and the regs, the key point I want to make here is that the Coast Guard has to consult with each state's state historic preservation officer for every state that's affected by a spill, as well as federally recognized Indian tribes to assess the potential impact of a spill event on cultural resources. And the reason for that is that under the law, our office, the State Historic Preservation Office, and tribes are recognized as the ones who would know where these sites are and how important they are. And that is information that we can provide to the Coast Guard and to the cleanup companies to help them appropriately minimize or avoid effects to cultural resources. So this is a slide showing the red dots there are archaeological sites. This is Barataria Bay in central South Coast Louisiana. So you can see in some places there are quite a few sites that if there was an oil spill there might potentially be affected by oil, and more importantly could be affected by the cleanup activities as they attempt to get the oil off the shoreline. So our first strategy is to try to prevent oil from getting onto an archaeological site. And in coastal areas, the most common way of doing this is putting out boom. Basically these long tubes filled with air or some other floatable material that basically act as a barrier on the surface of the water to try and prevent the oil from moving on shore. In the example on the lower right there, you can clearly see several layers of boom that have been put out to try and keep the oil from getting on the marsh in the background. The image in the upper left, you can see the little yellow and white lines between Fort Livingston and the rock wall there are a whole series of booms that were put out to try and keep the oil from getting on the fort. In that particular instance, we were not successful as the oil did get on the fort. But in many instances, boom can be very effective strategy to try and keep oil off. Our second goal then, if we can't keep the oil off of sites, is to try to minimize impacts to an archaeological site that's caused by cleanup activities. And here are 4 slides that just give sort of a brief sense of the range of cleanup activities that can happen. On the lower right and upper left, you'll see a lot of people doing manual cleanup. There's individuals literally out there with shovels, scraping up the oil and putting it into plastic bags. The top 2 images, you can clearly see they're also using mechanical means where they have the potential to move a lot of dirt very quickly and could do a lot of damage if there was an archaeological site there. The bottom lower left image, in some cases where boom doesn't work or, a breach in the levee is too small, they will put up and use bags of sand to try and block the oil from getting either onto the shore or getting into the marsh from the shoreline. But you can see, you're using heavy equipment to get out there. And so there's a potential to damage archaeological sites as you drive this equipment across places, or as you're scraping up the surface, you might pick up artifacts or other things and do damage to a site. In addition to the direct cleanup activities, we also have the ability to be involved in any related activities. So anything that's tied to the spill response, and this would include building access roads through the marsh so that you can get out to where the spill, get equipment out to where the spill is. As an example here, the image on the left, we would take into effect that proposed route and whether or not it would impact cultural resources, before it's built. Similarly, particularly with BP, they ended up hiring literally thousands of people to come down here and work on the spill to help clean things up. And there simply wasn't the housing available down here to hold all those people. So they built what are called man camps, which are basically temporary housing with trailers or portable buildings or other things. And so that's another potential impact on the landscape, is where they put those and where the utilities go and where you put your sewer lines and your septic tanks and all of that. And so on the right there is an image of archaeologists actually surveying one of these proposed man camps for the BP spill to see whether or not there would be any archaeological sites there that might be impacted if they built something there. So in addition to then trying to prevent oil getting onto a site and then trying to minimize effects, during the cleanup, then there's also what happens at the very end of the spill when basically you're trying to clean up the mess you've created. For those of you who might remember the BP spill, they put out literally hundreds of miles of boom across Louisiana's coastline. I don't even know what the total number was, but they basically exhausted the supply of boom in the continental US there for some months. But, storms come by, waves come by, boom gets dislodged from its original location, it washes up on shore. So you can see examples here on the left side of the slide where boom has become dislodged and is now, draped over the coast or buried in the mud. And so just the simple act of going and getting this boom and trying to clean up your response effort can also have an effect on archaeological sites. Similarly, the image on the right shows where people had put up a series of essentially big buckets or baskets to try and prevent oil from moving onshore. But when you go to remove those, obviously you're using heavy equipment, you're chewing up the ground. That's another way that you could have an impact on cultural resources. And then finally, I think I want to mention that in many instances, particularly for smaller spills in the marsh, the most effective way to basically clean up the spill is to burn off the oil products. That is, a lot of times these occur when the spills are in marsh grass or rosio cane, and there's simply no practical way to wash the oil back out into open water where you can get it. And so we actually had an example just about a week and a half ago here in Louisiana, where we did an in situ burn like this to basically burn off the oil that had spilled. This is another example, that our office and tribes were consulted about to see if we knew of any sites that would be affected by this, and to participate in the process. So this is a very brief view of what the State Historic Preservation Office's role is in trying to minimize or avoid impacts to cultural resources during oil spills. I want to be sure to point out, as I mentioned earlier, that our office and American Indian tribes have equal responsibilities here. Federal agencies have to consult with both of us because we are the holders. We represent the state and the state's citizens and its history. And tribes obviously represent their traditional knowledge and their historic areas of interest. And I say that because I know the next speaker is a representative of tribal agency, and so I'm trying to provide a nice segue into her presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chip. That was great.